Hello, welcome to this GAD webinar. I'm Heidi Stancliffe, editor of GAD. In light of the British decision to leave the European Union, the aviation industry is fastening its seatbelt and preparing for turbulent times. To what extent will Brexit affect the demand for air travel? Can airlines respond to the challenges posed? And is there a possible silver lining? I have the pleasure of introducing our panel today. As well as being aviation practice leader for Mott MacDonald, Chris Chalk is chairman of the British Aviation Group, the body which promotes British companies in airports and aviation in the UK and overseas. Before last Thursday's vote, he wrote, "The consequences of Brexit are too uncomfortable for many to contemplate." James Halstead was one of the first stockbroker analysts in London to publish research on the international scheduled airline industry on a global basis. Today he writes the acclaimed Aviation Strategy newsletter. Paul Kehoe is CEO of Birmingham Airport, the UK's 7th busiest airport, handling over 12 million passengers per year. And finally, we have Paul Whelan, who is currently non-executive director and special advisor to the president and board of Aviation Partner, one of Europe's largest ground handling companies present at 40 airports, and also non-executive director of AGS Corporation, the world's second largest GSE fleet manager. Our moderator today is Kata Cserep, Vice President and Managing Director of Airports at ICF International. Welcome everyone. Before I hand over to Kata, I'd like to remind you that we'll be taking your questions during the webinar today. If you have any questions, you can send them to us using the orange Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. We will also be live tweeting during this webinar, and you can join in the conversation using the hashtag GADWebinar. So, Kata, over to you.
Great, thanks Heidi. Thanks everyone for joining, and well done to GAD for pulling together a webinar exactly 7 days after the historic and quite life-changing results of last Friday. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel of our experts, and thank you for the four of you for joining as well. I won't speak for very long at the start, but I did just want to set the scene for the benefit of those who might have been on holiday for the last week or might not have spent too much time looking at what's been happening. So I've got a couple of slides just as intro, and then we will go straight into the questions and panel discussion. In terms of timings, as we know, the vote happened last Friday. David Cameron announced his resignation on the 24th. On Monday, Angela Merkel announced that there will be no negotiations with the UK until it invokes Article 50, a pretty strong signal. Since then, as I think most of us in the UK are familiar, quite unprecedented political turmoil has ensued. We're not going to talk too much about the politics of it, but what is important to note is that as of now, nothing has officially changed. Article 50 has not yet been invoked and is not expected to be invoked, although anything can change, until the new Prime Minister is in place, which is expected to be in September. Once that does happen, and if the Article 50 is invoked, the UK will have exactly 2 years to negotiate the terms of its exit from the EU. How have the markets responded to this? Most of us are quite familiar, but it's interesting to note that the FTSE 100 took a significant dip, has subsequently recovered to its pre-Brexit levels. The FTSE 100 is comprised of a number of very large multinationals, which might provide some insulation to the potential impacts of Brexit. The more domestic-focused FTSE 250 is still significantly down. As of yesterday, about 8% lower than before the referendum. And also, interestingly, the German DAX is still about 6% below what it was a week ago. In terms of sterling, It has also weakened very significantly. It is at its lowest rate versus the US dollar in at least a decade and has fallen very significantly against the euro. We will be discussing some of the implications of this, both positive and negative, as we get into the discussion. Lastly, this has grabbed a lot of headlines, certainly in the aviation market. The share prices of both UK and European airlines have tumbled. You can see on this chart the share prices of IAG, EasyJet, Ryanair and Lufthansa as well. Obviously not a UK airline, but the market sentiment seems to be significantly negative towards them as well. So all in all, a pretty gloomy immediate reaction to the referendum result, but we are only 1 week in, and what we're going to be talking about is not just how people are feeling and thinking today, but how things might play out. So I've got one more slide just to set up some of the discussion, and I won't talk about all of these, but really what we're talking about is the demand for aviation, and therefore the demand for the businesses which serve those passengers and cargo who will be travelling. So some of the main things to be thinking about in this discussion is obviously the impact on the UK economy, in terms of GDP and foreign exchange, the impact of potential regulatory constraints or opportunities, the reputation of UK PLC potentially, and the three main aviation demand segments: leisure, business, and VFR. So with that, I'll stop talking and start asking some questions to our panelists. And just to set the scene and make our listeners aware of how we all felt a week ago, I'll just start by asking the very first question. What was your initial reaction when you woke up on Friday morning? I'll start with Paul Kehoe.
Well, thank you, Kata. I was somewhat surprised because I was actually in Brussels, and having had a dinner the night before and talking about some of the opportunities that may exist in a Remain environment, and to wake up on Friday morning in Brussels was a very surreal experience indeed, to find that the UK had voted indeed out. And as I say, as you said, I think a week's been a long time in UK politics. It seems like a day is a long time at the moment, and I'm sure events have not yet quite finished in terms of where this will take us, and who knows what will happen next. But the news was disappointing, but I think in that disappointment we've got to look for the opportunities of finding a way forward, both in the short and long term.
Great, thanks, Paul. What about Paul Whelan, our other Paul on the panel?
Yeah, I like Paul, was very surprised that we were leaving the EU. It was like a nightmare. I wondered whether I was still awake or whether I was dreaming it, because certainly before I went to bed the night before, it looked like we were going to stay, and there was an air of optimism. And then to find early on Friday morning that in fact the public had voted to leave was quite a shock. And I think my main worry is that the people that voted to leave didn't really understand the true implications to the UK as a nation and our future trading position in the world. So pretty horrified as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. James?
Yeah, I must say, I woke up feeling, seeing the news and feeling utterly depressed by it, and then started working out how to get my Scottish passport.
Yes, I was looking at resurrecting my Hungarian one. And Chris, I know you were looking to the referendum result of potential Brexit with some foreboding, so you probably also felt quite depressed, is that right? Are you on mute?
Sorry, is that to me?
I'm certainly. No, it's Chris. So I went to bed expecting, because the Brexiteers said that they probably wouldn't get it. So I woke up in the morning and looked at television, changed my glasses, still the same result. utterly surprised, not what I was expected. My family is scattered across Europe. A team we have is largely from across Europe. And what does this mean? You know, what does this mean?
And on that, I also know before the call, Chris, we were talking about BAG representing British aviation. And you've already done a survey. Can you share some of your feedback on that, and then we'll move on to thinking about the market outlook.
Yes, there's 180 members of the British Aviation Group, and by nature they are British. Well, that's where they have UK operations, and so then obviously they will be affected one way or another. And so we've communicated a number of things. We've actually started a survey. Now this is just preliminary, but what we're finding is that generally they are concerned or very concerned about the UK future business, and that the impact will be negative. Now, on all of these, there's positives as well, and you need to think if you are exporting that a lower pound actually helps on some things. And perhaps we ask questions, well, what's the most significant concern? And at the moment, the one which ranks highest is the potential reputational damage on the UK, followed by future employment of EU nationals, along with the worry about future contracts and such like. We can look down the weeds, but actually, how's the UK seen by people outside? And I'm on the other side of the Atlantic at the moment, and it's quite interesting the perspectives which people see of the UK. There's a huge surprise.
Okay, thanks. That is interesting. Certainly, uncertainty seems to be a big worry for many stakeholders. In terms of the underlying demand for air travel, this is obviously something, Paul, you must have been thinking about from an airport perspective, how this might impact your traffic levels. James, presumably you're thinking about this from an airline perspective as well. I wonder if, James, perhaps first you could give your views as an airline analyst on the impact of the referendum result, the subsequent uncertainty and then eventual Brexit on aviation demand.
Yeah, sure. It's complicated, really, because one of the major things that the whole Brexit routine brings up is uncertainty about what's going to happen, and it's not just economics and exchange rate; it's also regulation. So the two go hand in hand with aviation, of course. On the economic side, well, it does look as if the UK GDP will be lower than it otherwise would have been, and so that will have a negative impact on outbound tourism, probably. The exchange rate fall, and with forecasts of it going down to about 120 to the dollar, suggests that will have an extra adverse impact on outbound demand. The positive side is that a lower exchange rate encourages more people in, but given that with the UK as a major originator of traffic, and I think it's about twice as many people go from the UK on air travel as come in, that sort of movement in the exchange rate probably won't make up for the depressing element on demand that the fall does for outbound travel. However, from a regulatory point of view, it is a little bit more disturbing, a bit more worrying, because if the UK leaves the European single aviation market, then two major carriers in operating out of the UK will be severely damaged. Ryanair, 30% of its seat capacity goes from UK airports to places other than Ireland, which probably wouldn't be affected. And EasyJet has about 40% of its seat capacity that doesn't touch the UK at all. And if the UK leaves the single aviation market, there's going to be quite a big disturbance in two factors. One is lack of capacity out of the UK, which means that people like British Airways would probably make quite a nice little bit of profit, and some of the charter carriers would do quite well. And secondly, EasyJet would be really uncomfortable, would probably try to move out of the UK into Europe, and Ryanair would move a lot of its aircraft into Europe, unless there's a regulatory environment in which they can satisfy it. So all I can say is, at the moment, it's all up in the air. The one who looks the least likely to damage from this is IAG, because of the strength of the hub at Heathrow. And one very positive thing for IAG and very negative for the rest of us in the south of England is that the third runway at Heathrow will probably never get built now.
And we're already on to the runway topic. So that is interesting, and because I also thought that about IAG, and then was very surprised to see that actually their share price fell the most out of the airlines that we looked at. How do you explain that?
Well, the one element of regulation that I didn't cover there is quite what happens to the EU-US open skies, and that is not quite so obvious, because the UK is a signatory, well, the HM government is a signatory to that treaty, and it depends on your interpretation of whether that is purely because of its membership of the EU or not. But for British Airways, with the strength of their position on the Atlantic and their joint venture with American, which is reliant on open skies and antitrust immunity, that, I presume, is one of the biggest reasons why it's been hit. In the past, British Airways particularly has weathered the changes in the exchange rate by very cleverly manipulating the amount of transfer traffic it pushes through Heathrow. Of course, Heathrow is full, but if traffic is low out of the UK, it does switch on those taps for transfer traffic.
Great, thanks, James. Now back to Paul Kehoe, from an airport perspective, the outlook on demand. What's your take?
Yeah, I think the situation comes back to the short and the long term. I think this summer is largely set, and other forces have dictated the direction of travel. And one thinks of the switch from Eastern Mediterranean to Western Mediterranean because of what's happening in Turkey, Egypt, and Syria. And so the travel patterns for the leisure market are set. I think a lot of people on business trips were slowing down in the short term for the summer now, and business trips will pick up back in the autumn. The immediate impact, of course, is for those tourists outbound who are about to change their money into euros and dollars are going to get less. But even at 119, 120, which it was trading this morning, that's a long way ahead of where it was in the dark days of the Depression, when it was down to 102 to the euro, almost parity. In fact, you were sometimes selling less than parity if you went through some exchange bureaus. So I think the summer sort of set, the capacities in there. It's what happens to next year's traffic, because they'll be programming that this autumn. I'm a bit more optimistic in terms of the outlook. I mean, the decision, I think, as I said before, was a shock, but let's look at what could happen. O'Leary is a very clever individual, and he employs some very sharp talent, and I'm sure he will think of ways of how he can get round some of the problems that James has just highlighted. For example, he does have a G-plate registration. He can resurrect his Buzz airline that he acquired from KLM and effectively operate that, I'm sure, because the common travel area of Ireland and the UK have older historic links in terms of open skies. I think the challenge for me, and even EasyJet theoretically could use their Switzerland model and Switzerland registration airplanes. I think the longer term impacts that are more worrying are on 5 aspects. I won't go into detail, but I'll just name them. And I think that's where the UK has been quite liberal in bringing to the party its views to Europe, and that's on open skies, airport charges, slots, security, and the whole case of Eurocontrol and air traffic control and gate-to-gate management. So I think those 5 areas I have more concern over, but again, I think the market will actually find a way.
That's a pretty positive take on events. Thank you for that. Paul, we have already had a couple of questions, most of them around this idea of the European single aviation market and the potential developments for bilaterals, open skies. How is this going to be negotiated? And James, I think you've already given some helpful guidance. Certainly our take from where we sit in ICF is that there are very strong incentives both from the EU side, from the UK side and the US side to ensure that some form of comparable arrangement is reached. It is not simply the UK airlines that are trying to get access to the EU. The UK is also one of the largest aviation markets. So other things being equal, and people negotiating in a rational manner, you would hope to expect that either the UK would remain in the common aviation area or reach agreement on comparable terms. I don't know if anyone on the panel agrees or disagrees with that assessment.
Well, if I can, Kata, I would add in that, yes, I do agree with that. The pragmatic assumption is that the industry will want to keep as open a skies as possible in the current regime. The question will be quite how the UK negotiates it. And as far as I can see, I'm not sure that aviation agreement will be very high on the list of the new government's negotiating powers. The importance of the North Atlantic US open skies is very strong, and so the suggestion is that there's not a lot that will change there. It is almost inconceivable that the industry will go back to a pure bilateral system. Apart from anything else, we've got to get the negotiators back to negotiate them again. And from all the indications are that most of those have found other jobs. On a practical point, I think there's not going to be a real amount of change. It's just the legality of negotiating to make sure that the UK airlines are still treated as European airlines for ownership and control purposes.
I'm somewhat more cynical. I think that given the problems that Norwegian have had to upgrade from into the US and really take advantage of the very historic treaty which was signed in 2007, which permits any airline in the EU to fly at any point in the US and vice versa. I think that the Europeans will make it quite hard. I think that we will have a long struggle to renew such a very liberal agreement that we have at the moment.
Well, we've already seen the reaction from those in the States opposing Norwegian in attacking their flights out of Gatwick to the States.
Yeah.
Just in the last few days.
Yeah, they've been dragging their feet, and I think that that's what's going to happen. I think it's not going to be an easy ride, but logic would dictate that it should be an easy ride. But we saw, in my view, something totally illogical last week, and therefore I think that sometimes logic isn't followed.
I think there's another factor here, and that is that many of the aviation treaties predate the EU. So they're more internationalist and come from ICAO, and indeed some of our work across Europe is with the ECAC and Eurocontrol, which involve more countries than those in the EU. So whilst the EU is important part of the whole thing, there are many more factors in terms of the rights, the landing rights that some air carriers have in the UK outside London. So it's effectively open skies plus outside London for regional airports. And I think these things can be exploited. And indeed, the Norwegian opportunity to have Irish registered airplanes is part of that as well. So I truly believe the market will always find a way, and I think aviation has been at the leading edge of this, even though it may not be the most important part of the EU-UK negotiations.
And I think if you look at Bermuda 2, which we'll revert to, we'll actually be forced to go back to Gatwick. Something will get worked out on that. My greater concern is what happens as far as UK business into Europe and the financial sector, and what sort of deal gets worked out, because that actually does affect quite a lot of what sort of traffic comes into the UK and the yields, not just the airlines but also for HM government from taxes and such like. The one thing we know is we don't know what we'll end up with, and do we end up in a sort of Norwegian type of model where we are outside Europe, we pay in, we have to follow most of the rules, and we have free movement of people? A lot of people are talking about that. Or is it something where there's a very, very hard boundary around, but a very much more difficult economic environment? At the moment, we don't know. We've got to work together to get the best solution.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Certainly our approach so far has been to try and think through different scenarios, and of course timing is one of them. Is it going to be a very prolonged process, even to get us to Article 50 being invoked? Certainly the parallels we draw with our morbid sense of humour is comparing it to the Runway decisions and the Airports Commission. We could foresee something comparable to that, and then of course the actual terms of the exit and the subsequent agreements will be critical. Just taking it back to Paul Whelan, you have obviously made numerous investments in aviation, have worked in different businesses across the aviation value chain. Have you noticed any immediate impact, positive or negative, from this on the way you are thinking about your businesses? And also from an investment perspective, do you expect either any positive or negative outcomes for the UK of the results of this referendum?
I think from an investment point of view, it's pretty disastrous for the UK. We've already seen Airbus's reaction to it. We missed the opportunity to join Airbus as a shareholder some time ago. We're now a supplier, which is fine. But obviously it could affect the supply chain to Airbus factories. We've seen a reaction from Finmeccanica, the owner of Augusta Westland, which is now known as Leonardo Helicopters. I mean, they expressed caution, saying that they really need to reduce their UK collaboration in major EU defence projects. So I think that we're seeing already quite a significant reaction from the major companies in aerospace. And in one of the companies that we're involved with, we've just restructured the whole group so that it was London-based. And we're now undoing that, and we're moving it to Shannon because it's a fleet manager, and therefore we need to move parts around the world. And it's going to be more difficult, potentially, to route through the UK.
So you are making that decision before actually knowing the final terms, or you are contemplating this as a
No. We've made it. We made the decision. We made the decision because we can't really see anything really changing. And also looking at the aerospace business generally, and investment in aerospace, it supports nearly 300,000 jobs in the UK, and in my view, we'll see that significantly reduced, and a lack of confidence in the UK going forward.
That's a pretty gloomy message. Do you see any upside from the exchange rate?
For me personally, it's great because most of my transactions are in euros, and I live in the UK, but not really. I think it's good for export, but this country is a great country for inward investment, and I think we'll see that dramatically reduced.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Does anyone on the panel have a different or potentially more positive view?
Well, all I said is that Rolls-Royce announced that they were not too concerned, and they're a major exporter. So whilst they bought the supply chain in a higher rate and now selling exports at a lower rate, they'll get more pounds as a UK PLC. And I come back to, I don't share Paul's negativity. I think we can talk ourselves into recession, or we can let them. We can do things that help us get the best deal. We are where we are. We've got to find a way forward in terms of allowing companies to invest, perhaps a lower tax regime. I noticed that George Osborne today has announced that he is getting rid of his target to 2020, allowing more fluidity and flexibility in the country. We could talk ourselves down, or we can say this is the situation we find ourselves in. How do we make sure we get the best out of the unfortunate situation we now find ourselves in? And that requires leadership in the UK to talk the proposition up, and it requires us to go out and do our best on exports, and also welcome tourists from all over the world who'll have a great experience flying into the UK, able to spend their dollars and euros over here, so that we can hopefully minimise the impact of the decision that we took last week.
Okay, that's definitely
well, that's very positive.
I would also say the UK has got a terrific reputation in innovation, in finding ways around problems. If you look at all the markets and such like, if there's a challenge, we worked really well with challenges. We weren't expecting this level of challenge, but I'm sure that we're going to put our backs into to work really closely with our customers, both in the UK and around the world.
Great, thanks, Chris. I've got a couple more questions that have come in, so let me just see which one. Quite a specialist one, which is asking about the UK's relationship with EASA. I wonder if anyone on the panel has any views on that. The sub-question being, will the UK CAA have to have a reboot in this area? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think as safety and security are way above politics and the first call of every airport and airline, we will go along with the safest route and most secure route. And if the UK CAA sees it stronger with the asset, it will do that. If it sees it stronger as a UK CAA, it will apply the higher of the two. That's always been the modus operandi. I cannot see that changing.
Okay, great. Excellent, thanks for that. So we've got a couple of minutes. We've been allowed to run over to 5 past, so I thought we could finish with just a couple of very, very quick question, one sentence answers to the two topics that I'm going to ask about. Not surprisingly, some of you will find this amusing. The first one is London capacity, and I'll be more specific on the question. And the second is, in 5 years, how will the aviation market look relative to how it might have done without Brexit? So the specific question is, what's your current guess on another runway in London? And I'll start that with Chris Chalk.
So when I woke up on Friday morning, I thought this means that Johnson takes over from Cameron, and Johnson was not a supporter of Heathrow. Johnson's gone. Latest polls of Conservative MPs show a support for Heathrow, but that's today. What's tomorrow? I have no idea on that one. But hopefully logic falls that we do get a positive decision to expand the capacity of the UK when the House sits in early autumn.
James?
No, I always had some doubt that any government in the UK would finally decide on airport capacity in South East. It's been going on for nigh on 30 years, and they can't make a decision on that. Basically, I'm being very pessimistic here, but I think every single UK government has not thought beyond its 5-year tenure as to building infrastructure. I doubt if, and the funny thing is that if Heathrow were to get its third runway, it would upset a lot of people anyway because of the cost of doing so. But my feeling is that it won't get built.
Okay, thanks, James.
On the second part of your question, I mean, looking forward 5 years, or do you want to come to that later?
Yeah, well, I'll circle back to that one to do and
okay.
I'll go around again. Paul Whelan, any thoughts on Runway?
I don't think Heathrow will ever happen, and I really think the government should refocus, because everybody knows, I think Paul in particular knows, that I'm a massive fan of Birmingham Airport. It's got one of the biggest catchment areas. I think it's the biggest catchment area in the UK, and therefore I think that we should look at a plan B and really put some thoughts behind what we can do to make Birmingham a much bigger airport than it is. So
that's quite a good intro for Paul Kehoe.
I know.
Would you agree with that, or Paul? What's your take?
Well, unlike my last response to Paul, I am going to agree with him this time, as you might expect. I think the challenge for the UK is that even if Heathrow were to get the go-ahead, it's probably a 15 or 20-year development plan. And can the UK afford to wait that long? And our view has always been great cities across the UK need great airports. And with HS2 arriving 10 years into that 20-year horizon for Runway through at Heathrow, we could do so much more here. Paul is right about the catchment, and we're ready and willing. And you know, there's this great manufacturing here, great city, and an airport that could be built to match those ambitions.
Great, thank you for that. That's excellent. So the last question, I just need one answer, number. Within 5 years, what will be the size of the UK aviation market relative to what it would have been if it were not for this vote? So higher by so much, lower by 5%, 10%. What's your estimate? Starting with, and I know, let's go back to Chris Chalk, same order.
Slightly higher, but with quite a lot of variation between airports.
James?
I wouldn't be quite so positive. I'd say about the same, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were higher, and with those variations as well.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Whelan?
Well, IATA thinks that traffic will be down by 3 to 4% by 2020. I think traffic will still carry on growing. It might be slightly different carriers, but I think it'll carry on growing.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement about that. Thanks, Paul. And lastly, Paul Kehoe.
Well, I believe it's going to be Asia's century, and we haven't seen Asia truly fly yet. And when they do start to fly, we haven't got enough capacity. So I'm going to say higher, but no doubt it'll be differently the same.
Great, thank you. I think somebody might need to mute themselves. And I think on that note, that forward-looking note, I'm going to hand over to Heidi to wrap up.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much, Kata. That's all we have time for today. We've seen a last-minute flurry of questions coming in, so what we're going to do is we'll get written answers to those and get them up on the GAD blog in the next couple of days. Do keep an eye on the GAD blog for more analysis of Brexit in the aviation industry. We've already got some great analysis from Kata's colleagues here at ICFI up there. We're going to be putting something from James Halstead's Aviation Strategies up in the next few days as well. So lots more coming there on the GAD blog. So thanks again to the panel and to our listeners for joining us today. We look forward to seeing many of you at GAD Asia just around the corner at the beginning of September, and then GAD World at the end of November in Lisbon. If you've got any feedback on today's webinar or any recommendation for future webinars, please do complete the short survey at the end of this session. It should flash up on your screen shortly. Thanks again and goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.